Everything that he says is absolutely 100% true. I am going to be talking to you about sensory issues, which is a pretty important topic when you're dealing with people with autism. Sensory is a word that gets used a lot to describe behavior and to describe problems and concerns and sometimes interventions. So my purpose is to first just deal a little bit with what sensory behavior is and what sensory issues are, and then how we can help people who are struggling in this area to be a little bit more comfortable in their skin and in the world and around other people. So the first point that I just want to make is that sensory behavior is something that we all engage in. This is not something that's unique to autism. If you want to see good examples of sensory behavior, look at any young child who doesn't have like social awareness yet. And I just put a couple of examples up there of things that kids do to make themselves feel better or because they feel good, you know, that you don't really see adults doing, hopefully, unless they think they're alone in their cars and nobody's looking at them because they have the invisibility shield. But that's sensory behavior. That's something that you do just because of the way that it feels, not because it doesn't get you anything else. It doesn't get you attention. It doesn't get you out of doing something that you don't like. For the most part, if something is classified as sensory behavior, we say that it serves an automatic reinforcement function. So that means that you do it just because of the way that it feels. Listening to Bon Jovi and watching medical dramas is something that I do because I enjoy it. Some people actually like these things. It just feels good. It doesn't. In fact, it gets me harassed sometimes. Buying a really big, stable ocean kayak for somebody because you don't want to see them get eaten by a shark is not sensory behavior. It's something that you're doing to avoid a situation. So the things that we're going to deal with in this presentation are the things that we see people with autism doing or not doing for sensory reasons. So just the first thing that I want to do is to put it in the framework of the experiences that we have as just people who have sensory experiences in the world. We smell things, we taste things, we hear things, we see things, and these experiences bother us more or less depending on who we are and where we're at. When you're coming off jet lag and not really sleeping, the tag in the back of your shirt can make you really crazy. Take it from me. Whereas that might be something that's really not going to bother you under normal circumstances or might not bother somebody else at all. There are people who love to cook. They like to get their hands messy and the smells and all of that stuff. Me, I like to eat. I would really rather not get dirty. I would not want to smell the onions being chopped. But if you put the food in front of me, I'll eat it. So sensory issues and sensory concerns come out of the experiences that I think we can all relate to in many ways. However, we have to acknowledge that when somebody has autism, their sensory experiences can be different than the ones that we're used to experiencing. So I put up the cover of this book because it's a pretty good book. It's a compilation of stories by people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism about their lives and how they've gotten to where they are and what their experiences are. It was compiled by Temple Grandin. And what's great about this book is that these individuals who contributed are all pretty successful people. So I looked through the book for their accounts of what it feels like to have autism in a sensory way. And I just wanted to share with you two of them that I thought were pretty interesting. One is from Stephen Shore, who's a college professor actually back in New York. And he has a pretty functional life. And he says, the way he describes it is, I was under-responsive in the vestibular and proprioceptive senses, and I was a sensory seeker. This may explain why I was and continue to be attracted to airplanes. Some of my favorite sensory-seeking activities as a child were riding my bicycle into a snowbank as fast as possible to launch myself over the handlebars. Who thinks that sounds like fun? Not me. Climbing a tree about 20 feet in height and jumping to the ground and swinging high on a swing set to find the perfect launching off point so that I could sail through the air and land softly on my feet. To this day, I still enjoy takeoffs on airplanes as well as when the ride gets turbulent. I don't. But there are people who enjoy that kind of sensory input. There are people who love roller coasters, and these aren't people with disabilities. But that rush or that feeling that you get from going on a roller coaster, that good feeling, might be something that you just enjoy for what it is, and then you can live without it for a year. What would it feel like to have the kind of nervous system that makes you crave that feeling all the time and not be able to get it? And that's what we want to think about if somebody is demonstrating behavior that seems problematic that might be related to sensory experience. Another example, which is sort of at the other end of the rainbow here, is from this woman, Anita Lesko, who, again, an accomplished person. She's a nurse, anesthetist, and a military aviation photojournalist, and she has an autism spectrum disorder. And she talks about sensory overload in high school. High school was just a continuation of the nightmare. It seemed to last 100 years. I think everybody could probably sympathize with that. In high school, having to migrate each hour from class to class among an ocean of people was a dreaded event. To me, the noise level was deafening and seemed to make everything around me echo. I worried that if I tripped and fell, the tidal wave of students would run me over and trample me to death. There were endless aromas of perfumes and colognes that added to my sensory overload. So an example of somebody who is really suffering from their sensory experiences, not seeking them the way Stephen was, but being overwhelmed by them. And that's another thing that we very often see with our students with autism. Just a quick note on self-reports. We want to be careful with those kinds of analyses of the way that people are feeling, descriptions of what it's like to have a sensory-based disability or disorder or a sensory problem. Self-reports are filtered through language. So it's like trying to explain to somebody who's been blind from birth what the color blue is. Or, you know, you have to use language to explain something that isn't language-based. So that's one thing to be a little careful of when you're hearing one of these accounts. There are also possible outside influences or expectations. So in Stephen Shore's account, he says that he was a sensory seeker, proprioceptive. He used words like that that mean that he knows a little something about this topic, which again could lead to a bias in the way that he's describing it. He could be describing it in a way that he wants it to make sense to us, which maybe is not a completely accurate way of really understanding it. So self-reports are just something we have to be a little bit cautious about. But with that being said, I just have a couple of more examples of range of experiences that people with autism describe. So for example, Temple Grandin, who's a very famous person who identifies herself as having autism and speaks about it quite a bit, and in fact compiled the book that I referenced before. She says, "My hearing is like having a hearing aid that with the volume control stuck on super loud. It is like an open microphone that picks up everything. I have two choices, turn the mic on and get deluged with sound or shut it off." And that seems like a pretty good explanation for why some of the children that we work with might shut down and stop seeming to listen and sort of close off. Maybe the sensory world is too much. Maybe listening is hard because you're not just listening to the thing that you're supposed to be listening to the person speaking, but you're hearing with equal intensity the humming of the lights and the traffic going by and, you know, the buzzing of a mosquito outside the window. I don't know. It's possible that this is an experience that people have. Here's another one, visual, a different person saying, "My eyesight blurred several tunes that day, and once I could see no more than a yard in front. I broke my collarbone falling off a radiator. My eyes were showing a wide windowsill where the radiator was, and I sat down, falling off instantly." So even the visual aspect can be distorted. Smells, like deodorant and aftercare lotion, they smell so strong to me I can't stand it, and perfume drives me nuts. And of course, Temple Grandin's famous example of craving touch but not being able to tolerate it. So when I was a child, I craved the feeling of being hugged, but then I withdrew because I was overwhelmed by the tidal wave of sensation. So why do people with autism have these sensory sensitivities and experiences. And there's a lot of theories and assumptions, and not all of them are necessarily accurate. There's not a lot of agreement. Sensory issues are a very hot-button topic, I think, because there's not always agreement in why they occur, how to treat them. But there is some recent research that's very objective, looking at the responsiveness of people's brains while their bodies are being stimulated in different ways with sights or smells or sounds, by looking at their brain's reactivity in, the most objective way possible, MRI machines and PET scans and things like that, and finding that in a neurotypical person, the responses are the same from moment to moment and across sessions, whereas with someone with autism, different parts of the brain will light up at different times, which could explain why the sensory input can be so difficult for someone with autism. If you don't know what to expect from one moment to the next of how you're going to process the world, that could be very difficult and upsetting, to say the least. But there are also possible behavior-environment interactions, and I just want to make sure that we don't forget that it's not always what it looks like. So you could have a child who is engaging in what looks like classic sensory behavior, maybe flapping their hands or spinning in circles or something like that, and it turns out to actually be something that is better explained by a behavior-environment interaction. Perhaps when this child starts to flap his hands, a parent comes over and gets involved and redirects it and starts to play with them to distract them. And maybe there is a real attention-seeking piece to that. As Bobby talked about before, it's really important to analyze the situation carefully, not to make assumptions, but to really collect data and to look and see if we are identifying, what is causing the behavior. So just because it looks like a duck, and maybe even sounds like a duck, it might not be a duck. It might not be, sensory-based in the sense of automatically reinforcing. It could be something that is more maintained by the environment. And then, conversely, it's interesting when you find behavior problems or concerns that seem to be sensory, seem to serve some sort of an automatic function. So, for example, I have a little guy that I work with he's 6 years old now. I've known him since he's about 3. And one of the things that we've worked on with him over time is he has some aggression that comes out. He'll pull hair, he'll pinch. And we've done the data collection, we've done the functional assessment of this behavior, and for the most part, it seems to happen when people are asking him to do things, and there's a demand component, but there's also an attention component. So we found that the best strategy when he begins to engage in aggressive behavior is to pretty much freeze, ignore it, and as soon as he stops, to get him back into the thing that was being done, to begin with. So if it's during a work session and he goes and reaches out and pulls the therapist's hair, she's just sort of got to wait for a minute, because if you start fighting with him playing that game, it escalates. There's an attention piece. But as soon as you sort of freeze and stop, he will release it, and then you just continue to present the demand so that that behavior didn't work to get him out of work. So that's a pretty basic, typical way of responding to that kind of behavior that has different kinds of functions. But what's interesting, it still happens at times. It still happens. We've been really successful with him with a lot of different things. But this is sort of a persistent problem over 3 years. There's still occasions when he will pull hair and he'll pinch. And I was in the car with his mom, and we were driving to visit a school for him, a potential school for him, and he was sitting in the back. He's 6, so he's decided to do the big boy thing and sit in the 3rd row instead of right behind Mom. And he was looking at his iPad, and he was babbling to himself. He's an emerging verbal learner, so he doesn't have a lot of language, but the language that he has is pretty functional. He's been taught specific commands and requests for the things that he wants. And we're talking about the school that we're going to see, and what do we think we should be doing for him, and we're just having like a normal volume conversation. And floating up from the 3rd row comes quiet. And the mother goes, "Oh, he wants us to be quiet," and she stopped talking. And I went, "I don't normally allow 6-year-olds to tell me to be quiet." It's a little rude, but you know, she must have something in mind here. So we waited a few minutes, and then in a really low tone of voice, she said, "Do you remember when I texted you, how do I teach him quiet?" I thought she meant, how do you teach him to be quiet? She wanted to know how to teach him to request quiet, because she noticed that the aggression was happening almost exclusively when it was noisy, when there was more than one person talking. So she did like a mom functional analysis. She didn't do a real formal one, but she noticed that, you know, the vast majority of the time, if more than one person was talking, that's when the behavior would happen, and it wouldn't happen during quieter times. So she taught him to request quiet. So, which is great. I mean, it's great for right now because he's not hurting people and he's able to make something stop that's bothering him. And I would call this probably a sensory issue if he can't tolerate more than one person talking at a time. But it's something that we're going to have to work on teaching him to tolerate, teaching him to be able to request quiet and not get it. You know, it was a good start, and I think she was definitely on the right track. But if he has a problem with more than one person talking and you want him to function in the environment that everybody else functions in, then we have to go deeper and address it there. But for a starting point, it was a great way to, you know, help him to deal with something that was bothering him, not to overwhelm him, and to keep other people from getting hurt. So that's an example of a place where that aggressive behavior looked to me like escape and avoidance and attention seeking and all of those different things at different times, but there was also this underlying sensory feature to it, in the sense that he needed that behavior, he was using that behavior to escape an unpleasant sensory experience. So some of the possible problems that people with autism can have in terms of sensory experiences, there can be, as I've described, distortions of sound, vision, touch, taste, smell. All of those things can be very intense, or they can be not intense enough, or they can be distorted. And then there's other sensory experiences like kinesthetic and proprioceptive, which have to do with movement and balance, hyper and hyposensitivity to different things, distortions, tune-outs, sensory overload, and synesthesia, which is a really interesting one, which is where the senses cross. So people will describe hearing colors or seeing music. And that will be described, and any of these issues could be described by anybody with a brain difference of any kind, somebody with a brain injury, somebody who's had a stroke. The brain is such a delicate, sensitive organ that the tiniest little impact on it or change in it can have a real impact on the way the person is experiencing the world. So some of what we know about these sensory differences in people with autism we also get from descriptions of people who don't have autism. But these are all ways that people can be having sensory differences, and to make it more complicated, they could have any, you know, constellation of these, any one or two or more of them. They could have them sometimes and not other times, and very often the person can't describe it to you, wouldn't even know to describe it to you because they don't know that you're not experiencing it the same way, and don't really know how to deal with or cope with it. So I think the functional analysis of sensory problems or issues is 100 times more complicated than when something turns out to be an escape function or an attention function or some other reason. When the variables maintaining the behavior are so internal that we can't see them, it's really hard for us to deal with them. And what we have to do is sort of infer them from the environment, from the things that we can observe. So it's good to know that these are the possible sensory experiences that your children or your students might be experiencing, but how you figure it out is another whole question that is, is another whole challenge. What we do is we focus on the behavior. So for the most part, we can break behavior down. If sensory-based behavior, we can break down into two categories. It can be sensory seeking and it can be sensory avoiding. Stimming is a popular common term for sensory seeking behavior, self-stimulatory behavior. So it's something that is being done just because it feels good. And that the classic examples include flapping and rocking, spinning, laughing, humming, singing, rubbing. You have kids who rub their feet on the floor to the point where they rub a hole in the carpet or can rub their own skin off. Looking from the peripheral vision, you see that a lot in students with autism where they'll have their iPad or a toy or whatever and they're looking at it this way. There's probably a sensory component to that. It probably feels good to do it that way, or I would be willing to accept that it's too overwhelming to look at it head on. So maybe it feels, you know, a little better to look at it from the side and it's more of an avoidant thing. But those are some possibilities. And scripting and TV talk is something that I would also put into this category because it's a pretty common response in verbal kids with autism who have real perseverative interests. So we hear the Thomas the Tank Engine lines over and over and over again. We hear, you know, lines from cartoons over and over and over again. And that's pretty much usually something that somebody's doing because they enjoy it, because it feels good, not because it's really getting them anything else. And then there are the sensory avoiding things that we see. Closing the eyes, you see kids covering their ears. I had a little boy who had this, I don't know how he did it, but he used to fold his ear and tuck it inside. Like the outside of his ear, he would tuck it inside. It was like he had no cartilage here. I guess because he kept doing it, he kept it soft. But stop it, take your ears out. But he was, you know, I don't know why he was doing it. Was he doing it because he would get that reaction, or was he doing it because he didn't want to hear what was going on? But that's, you know, a possibility. We have food refusal. Food refusal is a huge, huge issue in the autism population, and for some kids it might be a sensory problem. And parents will very often describe it that way. I had a student who would only eat Fruit Loops. Do you have Fruit Loops here? The round, you know. And he would only eat the green and orange ones. I'm not exaggerating. He would come to school every day with a Ziploc bag of green and orange Fruit Loops and a paper bowl. And his mother would must have been what she did while he was at school, separate out the Fruit Loops so that he could take only the green and orange ones. And she said that we talked endlessly about getting other food into him because this was clearly not healthy, not good. And she said that as soon as she takes out any other kind of food, he starts to gag, he starts to retch. She felt that it was completely sensory and that he just could not tolerate other textures. And this particular parent didn't want to work on that. She was okay with him eating nothing but green and orange Fruit Loops. But if it's a sensory problem, we can do that. We can deal with that. We can work on that. Just the same way that we could work on it if it was an attention-seeking or an escape or an avoidance problem. But food refusal can sometimes stem from a sensory aversion issue. And I think that's why we see the food issues coming up a lot in terms of textures or colors. So children who will only eat beige food, who will only eat crunchy food. There's, like, I call them the big C's, chicken nuggets, Cheerios, and chips. That's all that they'll eat. They're beige, they're crunchy, they start with the letter C. It's the autism trifecta along with Thomas the Tank Engine. But that could be, it could be just because the other stuff, a banana, just feels bad in the mouth. I don't know. Clothing restrictions. We have children who don't want to wear shorts and short sleeves in the summer, so they're walking around broiling in their long sleeves and sweatpants because they have to wear the same thing all the time. Or alternatively, you know, who won't wear coats, who doesn't want to wear a hat, who can't wear shoes. All of these things could be potentially sensory motivated. Difficulties with things like showers and haircuts and doctors. Granted, these are things that all kids don't like all that much. You know, I don't know a person under 16 who says, "Yay, I'm going to take a shower." But perhaps for somebody with autism, a shower is really it's just physically uncomfortable. Maybe the feeling of the water beating is very difficult. Going to the doctor. There's the whole fear. You don't know what's going to happen. There's a history of pain. But sitting on that crinkly paper on the examining table can make anybody feel a little icky. And if you have a sensitivity to sound and to touch, and that experience might be really, really difficult. Doctors are trained to put people at ease by talking to them. And that might be very overwhelming for somebody with autism. So there's a great article. It's a list of suggested things to discuss with your doctor if you're a person with autism who has sensory sensitivities. And to really think about yourself. Does it make you feel better when people talk to you, or does it make you nervous? Let your doctor know that ahead of time, so that when you're in a position that could be potentially really uncomfortable for you, they're not making it worse. And then finally, we have classic meltdowns. Things like Bobby was describing before, the young boy Dustin, who would scream and cry for hours at a time, and when they really couldn't find the environmental events, they were thinking it was internal. It was something that he was feeling. And we see this a lot. And it's very easy to attribute any of these to the sensory component and to say, well, it's internal, it's the way they feel, it's the way it is. And I would encourage you to not let that be your first response when you see any of this behavior, including the things that are really classic, like the rocking or the looking from the side. I would always want to rule out the environmental relationships first, because those are the things that we can control much more easily. But if we're finding that we're not able to identify a clear function for behavior, and it does appear to be something that's sensory, either because the person's reporting it that way, or we can see that when we do things like the mom I described before, once she taught him to say quiet, and people started to stop talking when he said it, he stopped pulling people's hair. So I don't think it's so out there to think that there was at least something about people talking that was disturbing to him. Whether it made him feel, was he having a synesthesia episode and he was seeing things when people were talking too loud, or did it make him dizzy? Did it just hurt his ears? Was it just annoying? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that she did find a way to make that situation tolerable for him. Of course, she made him into a little dictator by giving him the power to tell people to basically shut up, but that's okay for now. We'll work on that. So all of these different kinds of behavior could be sensory maintained, and any other kind of behavior that you can come up with could potentially have a sensory function. And if that's what it turns out to be, that's what it turns out to be, and that's where you deal with it. Now, I think, at least where we come from in New York, there is a real effort to understand people with differences, disabilities of all kinds, and autism in particular. There are great resources out there for doctors and dentists and people who are interested in learning about people with autism who are becoming more and more part of society and out there in everyday life. And I have to assume that it's like that here too. This is an example of a toolkit that was created by Autism Speaks for Dentists that would give the dentist an idea of things that they can do to make the sensory experience a little bit better for someone with autism, which is great. How many dentists have actually seen this? How many would read it, take the time to read it, and then implement it? How widespread can this be? Well, just because it's hard to do doesn't mean that you don't do it, and we don't keep educating people, but it might not be the solution to this problem. The solution might not lay in changing the dentist office, but in helping the person to change their reaction to the dentist. Another great example, this was on a recent newscast, again back home in New York, NBC News. The Fire Department of New York is actually training their firefighters in the special needs of people with autism if they encounter somebody with this disability during a rescue. So these are just some quotes that I took from the article. The person who was speaking is the father of a child with autism, and he comes from Massachusetts, and he's been traveling around and training all of the New York firefighters. First, approach in a quiet, non-threatening manner. Be wary of touching them. He says some might fight back. Use simple, short instructions like get up or wait here. Never use slang. These are things that people don't really realize. And, you know, look, my parents had a fire in their house about 11 years ago. And the fire started in the basement, and the firefighters came in and they broke every window. And there was smoke and water damage throughout the entire house. And that's fine. You're going into a burning building, you do whatever you need to do to keep you safe and hopefully, you know, save the building as much as possible. And I don't know that we can expect firefighters to walk into a burning building and remember to approach somebody in a gentle, safe, non-threatening manner and not use expressions, you know. But in the situation where it's not a danger, where they can take the time to know something like this is pretty important. To know that the parents might keep the doors locked, might have that child's bedroom door locked because they're an eloper and will get up in the middle of the night and leave the house, that's a good thing for the person walking into the situation to know. Or if your firefighter's walking into a house on fire and a typical kid is there, they might be happy to see them and, you know, make it easy for the firefighter to take them out. But somebody who's fighting you might be fighting you for a different reason and might be, you know, really scared. So this is wonderful. And to whatever extent we can educate the world and make it a more comfortable and safer place for people with sensory differences, I think that we should. But as I said, it's a long process. It's great that this is happening in New York. Is it happening here? No. So what happens when a child with autism has a fire in their house here? Firefighters aren't going to know. You know, they're not going to necessarily have this information. Even in the places where the training is happening, not everybody is going to be there that day or remember it in the time. So it comes back to the individual and really empowering them to survive in the same world that everyone else is surviving in, because you might not always be there to protect them, or you might not always be there to explain it. So should we reduce sensory behavior? Should we deal with it? This can be something that I think can be a little bit controversial. And I would say there's no blanket answer. There's no, yes, absolutely, no flapping, stimming, rocking, and, you know, get used to loud noises and live with it. But you want to thoughtfully consider. Anytime you're going to undertake any kind of an intervention to change someone's behavior, you owe it to them to really think about what you're doing. It's a pretty powerful thing. So some of the questions that we'll ask: is it dangerous? Is this something that they're doing that's going to put themselves or someone else in harm's way? Is it disruptive to others? Is it hard to be around them when they're doing this? Is it limiting their access to certain environments? Can you not take him to birthday parties because when he spins around in circles, it's disruptive to the other kids? Or because you know, you can't convince everybody to sing happy birthday at a nice, low, even tone, which incidentally is something that I asked the people to do at my son's first birthday party, because he fell asleep. He slept through most of his party. We finally woke him up to have cake, and I had to ask everybody to sing quietly because I didn't want them to startle him. But that's not, you know, it's cute for a 1-year-old. It's not so cute when we're 6 and 7 and we're at our friend's birthday party and we're not able to tolerate the singing. Does it lead to reduced availability for learning? That's a big one. If you're so busy doing something that feels good, like scripting, talking about your Thomas movie, that you can't listen to what other people are saying, you can't put it aside and do your homework or your, you know, schoolwork, or even learn how to play a game and interact with somebody, that could be a problem. That might be something we want to address or reduce. Is it stigmatizing? Does it make the person stand out? We have people on the autism spectrum who explain quite clearly that they want to have friends and that they're sad that they don't have friends, but then they do things that drive people away, that scare people. So, you know, it would be great if we could get the rest of the world to be more open and accepting and tolerant, and I think we should keep working on that. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you a little bit of information. You know, if you want friends, these are the things you need to not do anymore. Picking your nose is not cool. You could get away with that up until a certain age, and when you're in your car with your invisibility shield on. Outside of that, you're going to lose friends if you do it. And I think we can put rocking, flapping, scripting, and covering your ears in that category. Often, unless you live in a really great place. Does the individual want to stop doing it or change it? Sometimes they will express that. Sometimes they will say, you know, I wish I could, I wish I didn't have to do it, but I feel like I have to. And if they're distressed by it. So a lot of the sensory overload issues are clearly fall into that category. So somebody who is mainstreaming into a general education school setting and they're not able to eat lunch in the cafeteria because of the noise. That's distressing. It's distressing to them, and it's distressing to their teacher and their parents and everybody else. They're missing a whole social aspect. They probably would rather eat in the cafeteria, but it's noisy. Have you been in a general ed cafeteria lately? It's a nightmare. It's overwhelming. So it's really understandable that a child who maybe came from a very small, sheltered environment would have a hard time transitioning to that. And the better thing to do might be to help them to tolerate it. This It's a Stimmy Day is a t-shirt that sometimes we see parents wearing. It's a Stimmy Day. I'm all for accepting your child, but you know, sometimes there's a problem with being stimmy, and all the things that I just described, you know, including it makes you look weird, it makes it hard to do the things that you want to do or need to do. It can lead to reduced access to things. It can be overwhelming. It can even be dangerous or self-injurious. So even if it's not self-injurious behavior to the extent of hitting yourself in the head or biting your hand, if you're rubbing, I had a student who would do this rubbing thing. She dented her bone. I mean, it wasn't violent. It wasn't what you would classically call self-injury. It was stimming. But she did it so persistently that she was distorting her own face. And then there's the practical consideration. Another great book that I don't have the exact reference to here, but Patricia Romanowski-Bash, who wrote the Oasis Guide to Asperger's, came out with a recent book about teaching self-help and sort of normal life skills to teens and young adults with autism. The things that we're so busy teaching them to talk, we're so busy teaching them to play and be with other people, that we forget to teach them to tie their shoes or be able to make a sandwich. So that's what this book is about. And just a quote from this book, many independent skills involve sensory input that could be distracting, annoying, or highly aversive to your child. Classic examples include the taste of toothpaste, cooking aromas, or the harsh smell of cleaning supplies, the texture of tools or implements, or the appearance of specific foods. Kids with poor proprioception might find it difficult to wash dishes without chipping or breaking them, or to maintain their balance while standing on even a low step stool, or to carry an object using a proper grasp. So these kinds of behavioral differences or sensory differences can impact even the most simple life experiences, things you want people to be able to do. She doesn't say it, but sitting on the toilet requires some balance, and dealing with the emptiness. I can't believe I'm saying this and being recorded, but there's things like that that can be very limiting and disturbing for people. Being able to carry your plate from the table to the sink might be the kid's not doing it, not because he's lazy or doesn't want to, but because he just doesn't have the balance to coordinate those two things. So this is all stuff to consider. And then we have the right to effective treatment. And this really important article from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 1988, it tells us that we need to do the things, we need to use behavioral treatment to help people to acquire the functional skills that promote independence. And the misspelling of treatment was mine, not theirs. And then this is another quote from that article that I think is pretty important. Just take a minute to think about it. Decisions related to treatment selection are based on information obtained during assessment of behavior, the risk it poses, and its controlling variables, on a careful consideration of the available treatment options, including relative effectiveness, risks, restrictiveness, and potential side effects, and on examination of the overall context in which treatment will be applied. So all of that is just to say that we think about it really carefully when we go to change somebody's behavior. We think about why it's happening, we think about the risks of leaving it alone, we think about the risks of changing it, and how is it really going to improve somebody's life to deal with this. So with all of that being said, I have some specific suggestions for ways to potentially cope with sensory issues. My disclaimer, though, is, again, everybody's an individual. Every situation is an individual. I'm going to talk about some examples, but this is by no means anything that you want to take and apply without really seriously considering the individual person that you're dealing with and where they're coming from. So I might discuss, let's say, food refusal as a sensory issue, where in your case, the child that you're dealing with who has food refusal, it might be a completely different story. So be sure to do that kind of real assessment and analysis before jumping into something. So the first potential response to sensory issues is to leave it alone. You cannot do anything about it. You can say, this is the way the person is, this is their experience of the world, this is the way they cope with it, and I'm going to leave it alone. Now, this is not the same as encouraging or enhancing it. So I literally can't think of a time when I would say, give them something to stim with. Give that child the opportunity to flap and spin. Encourage it, reinforce that, do it with him. I would be open to discussing why you might want to do that, but I haven't, in my experience, ever felt that. But I could say I've had experiences with children who were so impaired and so needy across so many different areas that when it came down to it, the important things to work on were keeping them safe, getting them to communicate in some way so that they could get their wants and needs met, and maybe getting some food into them. And that's what we were going to worry about. And if he wants to play with a ribbon and look at it and do this during downtime, we're going to leave that alone. It's okay. Right now, we're not looking at a real typical environment for this kid. He doesn't, unfortunately, have friends who are going to be turned off by that. He's not getting invited to birthday parties. And there's so many other things that we have to work on first that we're going to not make that a priority. If it's not bothering anybody, if it's not, causing any problems, there's no need to battle. There are certain things that we do that are personal preferences, like listening to Bon Jovi, that shouldn't bother other people, that we should be allowed to do freely in our own homes and cars. There's some very limited examples of food refusal that I will say we all have a little bit of food refusal. I don't like raw onions. I won't eat something with raw onions in them. Do I need a treatment plan? Does anybody have a big problem with that? Is it limiting my life? No, I can live that way, so it's okay. If this, it's not to say sometimes parents and teachers, I think, go a little bit overboard, and you have to be able to eat everything. You have to be able to wear every, article of clothing. I think it's okay if we cut the tags out if that's bothering you. It's okay. It's not okay if you can't wear something with long pants because that bothers you. That's going to be limiting. That's going to keep you out of cold places. You'll never ice skate if you can't wear long pants. So that might be something we would deal with. But if it's easy, if it's small, if it's not dangerous, if it's not bothering anybody, we can leave it alone. We want to make sure that it's not limiting access to other experiences, it's not leading to rigidity. Some of these things look really innocent, and then when they get challenged, you suddenly find out that there was a whole world of, danger in this. We had a student years ago who apparently had tons and tons of little rigid obsessions that nobody realized because they looked kind of normal. So he always sat in the same seat on the bus. But everybody does that, right? Everybody does that. When I use a public restroom more than once, I go to the same stall if it's available. When you're taking a class, you tend to sit in the same seat. You all went out for coffee. You probably came back and sat in the same seats. It's kind of okay to do that. It's fine. The day, though, that we realized that his belt buckle was broken and his seatbelt was broken, he couldn't sit in that seat, and he punched the bus matron in the face, we said, oh, okay, he's not sitting in that seat because it's what anybody would do. He's sitting in that seat because he has a problem. And we also found out later on, upon looking at this, that he always had to put the right sock on first. He always had to walk through the door with the left foot first. He had tons and tons of these. And by not challenging them, because we didn't see them, because they were really so very normal, he was kind of really challenged in his ability to participate in the world whenever anything got shook up just a little bit. So we started to work on it. But sometimes leaving it alone is an option. Another option that may be available is to accommodate. So as I talked about before, we have dentists and we have firefighters who are learning to help people with autism to deal with things. There are a couple of other examples that I found in, where was this? Oh, Montgomery, Alabama, special movie showing for autism-friendly, sensory-friendly movie showing. They were targeting kids with autism, ADD, and ADHD. They had a sensory-friendly matinee, which included brighter lights, so they didn't make the theater really dark. The noise level was turned down a little bit. All of this I can agree with, but the children were also free to be themselves. So to me, this kind of goes beyond accommodating into enabling. If the loud noise and the darkness is scary, we can work on that. We can make the theater less troubling to you. You're still very limited because you're only going to these sensory-friendly showings. But if you're bouncing around and talking and flapping and yelling, you're still disturbing other people. And these people chose to create this environment where the parents all felt that they can deal with that. I guess the other kids weren't saying anything about it, so it worked for them. But I would just be a little careful with this kind of accommodation, that it doesn't lead to enabling things that you don't want people to necessarily do. Because one day you might want to go to the regular movies. You might want them to be able to do that. Another example somewhere else, where was this? Sensitive Santa. Thought this was cute. They had a, in Ohio, New Philadelphia, Ohio. This is a quote from the article. The Santa area will become sensory friendly, meaning the lights and music will be turned down, staff will be instructed to avoid loud, distracting movements, and the mall will be closed to shoppers. So going and taking a picture with Santa, something that all children hate to do. I have a picture of myself crying on Santa's lap when I was 2. But we could make it a little bit more comfortable, you know, maybe for the child with autism. Maybe they would enjoy it. Maybe if it wasn't loud and noise and crowd and workers yelling and people, you know, just being abrupt. I mean, there's that scene in A Christmas Story, if you've ever seen that movie, where he's waiting to see Santa because he's going to ask for the Red Ryder BB gun with the whole thing, and he finally gets up there and he's so overwhelmed that he can't even get it out, and you know, it's ho, 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 and then it's over. But maybe a sensitive Santa would be a good thing. And that's great. If we can create those situations for people, I think we should. But just be alert to these kinds of accommodations that can be just as stigmatizing as the original problem. So one of the things that I see as a pretty common accommodation for kids who are noise sensitive is giving them headphones. And this is interesting. If you've been aware of music and headphones technology, I mean, we had Walkman, right, which was like a decent-sized thing with a clip that you could wear on your belt, and headphones like foamy things that you put over your ears and you listen to music. And then we had Discmen, which were a little bit bigger, and you could put a CD in it, and it would skip and everything while you were trying to listen to it, but you were trying. And then we wind up with the iPods and the Shuffles and the Nanos. It got really tiny, and now it's your phone and bigger, smaller, and the ear stuff gets bigger and smaller too, right? We went from the foam things to really big things to earbuds. How's that for a sensory experience? Jam something into your ear that noise is going to come out of? Who loves that? I don't, but people do it. And then now I'm noticing the trend in New York, I don't know if it is here, is back towards the big ones. But now they're like, they have leather on them and gold and all kinds of things to make them even more bigger and obvious. It's the kind of thing you would have been mortified to wear 5 years ago, but now this is the big thing. So, okay, so we put these on these little kids when they're going into an assembly at school or a cafeteria. I don't know. I mean, maybe it looks better than doing this, but it doesn't look quite right. It's really not helping. It's not helping them to deal with the sensory overload. Those headphones might not always be available. You know, that might be a separate sensory issue. So I would just be careful anytime we're looking at accommodating that, again, we're not enabling and we're not accommodating in such a way that is making the person stand out more or be more uncomfortable or be looked at more, if that's our goal is to help them to fit in. Okay. The next level of intervention that I would suggest, if you can't leave it alone and if you can't accommodate it, would be to build coping skills. And this is usually pretty good for behavior that arises from fear and anxiety. So if you can figure out to a reasonable degree of certainty that the behavior is happening because the person is afraid of a sensory experience or they're really not enjoying a sensory experience and they want to escape from it or avoid it, this might be where you would go. So you could do some functional communication training, which Bobby described before, teaching people to say, I don't like that, or it's too loud, or I'd like to leave. These are all ways of learning to cope with potential sensory overload or other sensory problems. The little boy that I mentioned to you before, teaching him to say quiet, was a good functional communication way of stopping something that he doesn't like. Sometimes, though, we can't stop something that you don't like, unfortunately. You need to get a haircut even if it doesn't feel good. You need to have your teeth cleaned even though you don't like it and even though you're saying, I don't like this. So another set of strategies could be to use some visual cues or other ways to manage anxiety. So pretty much any strategy that helps the person to focus a little bit more on what they need to do and how they need to get through it can be very helpful. So schedules, sometimes for people with autism, just knowing what's coming makes a world of difference. I'm in this school, to take an example, surrounded by people who are telling me what to do all day long. Sometimes what they're telling me is accurate, sometimes it's not. Sometimes this bell starts ringing and I have to suddenly leave the building. Sometimes, somebody else has a big tantrum and I can't escape. But maybe just knowing, well, the next thing, right now we're doing math, which I hate, but the next thing that we're doing is lunch, which I like. So that gets me through this particular time period, even if it's something that is sensory unpleasant to me. Maybe I can get through sitting in music class if I know what the next thing is after that. Choices, giving people options. You have to go to music. I know you don't like the noise. You can choose. You can sit in the front or you can sit in the back. You can choose which instrument you're going to play. Anything like that that we can do to make experiences a little more reasonable. And then there's another kind of strategy, timelines, which I'll show you an example of. I have a student, a 13-year-old boy, who's pretty high functioning. He's got a lot of language. He's doing grade level academics. We've worked on a number of things. My relationship with him is that I'm his mother's parent trainer. So I work with her. She tells me the things that are concerning her, and we, problem solve them, and she implements them. One of the big problems was getting him off the computer. Once he starts, it's impossible to get him off. He's 13. She can't pick him up and move him anymore. So he needed to be motivated to get off the computer. And the way we did that was we made their house a cruise ship, and dinner is served at a particular seating time. Dinner is available from 6 to 6:30. If you have not gotten off the computer by 6:30 and come down for dinner, oh well, it's gone, and you can have cereal or a peanut butter sandwich for dinner, which is not as harsh as it sounds, because he had a decent appetite and he ate a variety of different things, but there had to be some limits. There had to be something set. So we were working on these kinds of issues, and one day out of the blue I get an email from the mom. He's going to have a blood test tomorrow, and it usually takes 6 people to hold him down. What do you recommend? I recommend that you tell me these things well in advance of the day before you need to do them, because I can't really help you right now. What I can tell you right now is bring 6 people tomorrow. Take a Xanax before you go. I don't know what to tell you. But with a little preparation, knowing that somebody has a needle phobia, you can help them with that. You can work on that with them. So this is a strategy that it can work with somebody who responds well to visual cues and who has sort of a sense of time. You can show them a timeline that lays out for them, this amount of time we're going to be waiting in the doctor's office. You're going to be feeling okay. It's a blue time. This is not a time you need to be anxious. You don't need to worry about anything. When we go in and we're talking to the doctor, how do you think you're going to feel? You're going to start to feel a little nervous. It's kind of like a yellow time. But it's a decent amount of time that we're just talking to the doctor. Nothing is going to happen that's painful or upsetting or anything. When we do the prep for the blood test, that takes a little bit of time. You're going to feel kind of scared. And these are the things that you're going to experience. The tightness on your arm, the coldness of the alcohol. You would work through, all of this with the student. Obviously, this is going to work for somebody who has sufficient verbal skills to take all of this in. The actual blood test and the feeling of pain is like a drop in the bucket compared to the whole rest of the thing. So showing them that the part that you're so worried about lasts 30 seconds in the context of the 2 hours of your life that this is going to, be involving, can really help to calm things down. Then after the blood test is over, you're right back to blue. You're feeling relieved, you're getting a bandage, you're leaving the office, you're still feeling good, and then we're getting ice cream and you're feeling happy. Implementing something like this with that student, the next time he went to have a blood test, he put his arm out, he had his thing to look at, his mom, pointed to it as they went along. Okay, this is the part you're at, this is the part you're at, all right, now it's going to hurt. And he was okay with that. He just needed to know, how long would it last? How bad would it be? And it really, really helped him. There's different ways to implement these kinds of strategies with people. Obviously, somebody who doesn't have a lot of language and who can't process all of that language or is not responsive to visual cues, this isn't going to be helpful. But it's something to, to possibly think about if somebody's really dreading a sensory experience. Giving them as much information as possible about what that experience is, how long it's going to last, and role-playing even, how they might feel and what they might be doing during the time could be a good thing. Another strategy for approaching these kinds of behavioral issues is to set a time and place. So there are things that people like to do that they can do if they want to do them. They just shouldn't do them in public. I'm not going to give you an example, so you can use your own imagination. But everybody has things that are not appropriate to do in front of everybody else. It doesn't mean you can't do them. And there's no reason why students with autism can't learn to restrict their stims to an appropriate time and place. We had a student who had a big flapping thing, and his eyes would cross and he would tense. He had this whole body sort of stim that he would do. It was problematic. He was in a self-contained classroom, so it wasn't really too stigmatizing because his peers didn't really notice, but we wanted to start to get him into the mainstream. It also made him unavailable for learning. When he was doing that, he wasn't listening to his teacher, and it was very hard for him to turn it on and off. So I met with the teacher, we talked about it, and I said, well, let him go. You have a little separate room. She had like a little annex on her classroom. Let him go in there every once in a while and just do it. Go do it, have a party, and then come back and you'll be ready to work. Teach him how to ask for that. What I neglected to do was to really make sure that she understood, how you want him to ask for it. Because when I came back, he was saying, can I go stim in the closet? And she was going, sure, and he'd go, stim in the closet, which is fine, but it would have been a little, more in line with getting him ready for mainstreaming if he would have just, asked for the bathroom, or can I just have a break for a minute? But you can teach people to get their stims under control, do them under certain circumstances, and then stop doing them. If you don't do it all day, when you get home, you can go into your bedroom, do it all you want. And kids, again, self-report is not always to be trusted, but we have had accounts of people describing, I can get through the day knowing that when I get home I can play with my string. Okay, that's what does it for you, fine. Other people have to play with their iPhone. You play with your string. We can do this with clothing preferences. The boy that I mentioned before with the needle phobia, he wants to wear nothing but sweatpants and white t-shirts. That's what he wants to wear. We have required him, he only has 2 white t-shirts in his drawer, so once he wears those before he has to wear other stuff until the laundry gets done. He has to wear jeans to go to school because it's socially appropriate and he needs to be able to wear something other than sweatpants. But when he gets home, he's welcome to change into his sweats. Go ahead, have a party. I don't care. I do it. That's an example of time and place. Seeking out pressure. We have kids who do this. You hear about it all the time. They're smashing themselves up against the wall as they're walking in the hallway, or they're crashing into people. In the absence of another function for that behavior, we might assume that they're seeking out some sort of a stimulation, and there are ways to get that appropriately. You can ask for a hug in some circumstances. You can't, if you're unfortunately a high school student, you can't ask your teacher for a hug. But you can, if you need to, if it makes you feel better, you could wear a really tight shirt under your clothing. There's nothing wrong with that. Nobody has to know about it. And it gives the person the input that they're looking for. It makes it a little bit easier for them to function and cope, and they're able to get on with their life. And scripting and video talk, I think, is another one that lends itself well to this. You want to talk about Thomas the Tank Engine? I understand. I have things that I like to talk about too. I can't talk about them all the time, and you can't talk about that all the time, but if you work with me for the next 45 minutes and you talk about the things I want to talk about, we will do 5 minutes of Thomas talk, I promise. And sometimes if you're good at this, you can change it into a really functional activity, like being in a play. So I had a student who was a big scripter. He was, movie talk all day long. And it was his mom's idea. She involved him in a children's theater group. If he's so good at memorizing scripts, let's give him a script to memorize. And he loved it. It was a great social, recreational activity that kind of fed into his strengths, if not his interests, because there were no Thomas the Tank Engine plays to be in. But being able to memorize a script and say it was reinforcing enough for him. The content wasn't even that important. And it was a really nice alternative to his behavior that had been a problem. So just some examples of the ways that you might implement that kind of an intervention. A talk ticket, if you have 3 of these for the school day, and at any time that you feel that you need to, you can exchange this for 5 minutes of TV talk. But once they're gone, they're gone. Just a simple self-monitoring checklist. These are the times that I can be alone in my room to play with my string, and I can see when they will occur, I can see when they're over, and when I need to stop. And just using a simple timer to let somebody know, this is, for this duration, the behavior is allowed, for this duration, it's not. These are all ways that you can start to put some limits on sensory-based behavior and make it a little bit, more acceptable to the world. What time am I supposed to stop? Just.
Lunch is marked for 1.
And it's 1?
3 minutes ago.
I'm almost done. Can you hang in there?
My fault. I went over a few.
All right, so blame him.
Why do you anything else we go?
Bobby started to talk about systematic desensitization before, so I won't go into it in detail, but it can be used for sensory sensitivities. So build up somebody's tolerance for something. If it's clothing, you know, we might not start with you. If you want to wear shorts and t-shirts all the time, I'm not going to force you to wear a snowsuit, but we could start with longer shorts and 3/4 sleeves, and we can gradually build up tolerance. If it's a haircut, we might start with just walking into the barbershop, saying hello and leaving. Make sure you find a barber who understands what you're doing. Because the next day, or maybe even later that day, you'll walk in, you'll say hello, and you'll leave. And when you can do that fluently, then you're going to walk in, sit in the chair, and then leave. That's all. This is all we're doing today. We're not going to cut your hair. We're not going to take the big scary buzzer thing and rub it all over your head. You're just going to sit in the chair. And you gradually build it up. The next time, you're going to go in, sit in the chair, put the cape on. And that's it. And gradually and slowly, and you know, by the time you're finally getting a haircut, your hair is down to your waist, but it's not going to be the traumatic experience that it was before, because you are desensitizing to the different experiences. And in fact, with haircuts, we often recommend, if somebody really has a problem with it, to practice at home. Just touching the head, moving scissors around by the head, moving the buzzer around by the head with it turned off. I've had parents who, you know, I go to see the kid, I'm like, whoa, who got into a fight with a lawnmower and lost? Why is half his head cut? Because I do it when he's sleeping. This isn't good. We need to be able to tolerate a haircut. We can learn how to do that. Same thing with things like increasing food acceptance. We don't have to go from eating nothing but the 3 C's, Cheerios, chicken nuggets, and chips, to having a salad, but we can start to gradually move you in that direction. So, you know, if today you are able to tolerate a chunk of banana on your plate, you don't have to touch it, you don't have to look at it, you don't have to taste it, it's just there, just live with it, that's great, that's a step. And then over time, gradually, I just want you to touch it, and then I want you to smell it, and then I want you to put it in your mouth, and, you know, you could spit it right back out if you want to. But half the time, when somebody actually tastes the food, they realize it wasn't so bad, and they're willing to eat it. And then you're gradually building up to different kinds of tolerances. So practice should be regular and consistent. This is not, when you're doing systematic desensitization, you don't want to stop and start. If you're going to get on the train, stay on the train. Start the desensitization and see it through. And the point, again, Bobby mentioned before, I'm not suggesting flooding. Flooding is a different story. Flooding is, you know, we're going into the cafeteria and you're going to stay there throughout the whole entire lunch period, and you're just going to deal with it. And if you cry, and if you fall on the floor, and if you know, try to hurt somebody, we're still staying there. That's not always the way to go. I'm not saying it's never the way to go. There might be a compelling reason to do that, but for the most part, we can do things a little bit more gently, and we can expose people to these experiences. And as soon as they start to feel any discomfort, stop. You went too far. The whole point of systematic desensitization is to take somebody from 0 to 60 without them noticing that they did it, without them being upset, without them falling apart. So it's okay. You can always go back a step. You can always, you know, you'll push it again the next time. And these are just some examples of steps that I might take when I'm desensitizing somebody to some common things, like wearing summer clothes, the opposite of what I was saying before. We have the children who don't want to pack away their long pants and long sleeves, but they're fainting from the heat. You know, we could get up to 100 degrees sometimes at home, Fahrenheit. And then entering the cafeteria is another big one. So the first day, we might just walk into the empty cafeteria. Nobody's there. You're not eating lunch there. You're just going to walk into the room. And then when you're doing that really fluently and with no problems, we're going to just walk in and sit down. That's all. And we gradually build our way up until we're actually walking in while there's a room full of people and everybody's talking, and we sit down and we eat and we get through the whole thing. And you could do this. It could take a week, it could take 2 weeks, it could take 6 months, but who cares? Eventually, that kid's eating in the cafeteria with everybody else, and you can move on to worrying about the next problem. Functional analysis and replacement. This is difficult when the behavior is sensory-based. It's very hard to replace that sensory experience. To the extent that you can, it's a good way to eliminate sensory behavior that's problematic when the reinforcer is very powerful. So an example that I mentioned earlier was wearing tight clothing to replace that pressure-seeking behavior. Teaching a student to request a hug instead of acting out to get restrained. Providing visually appealing toys to replace visual stims. If it works, if you're matching the input that the person is getting from their behavior, then you have a chance at reducing the less appropriate way of getting those things. And it's just important that the replacement works as well as the original. It doesn't work well when the person gets caught up in the reinforcer or when you have an approximation, but it's not quite the same. So giving somebody toys to look at that have lights and things is great, but if that's not meeting their sensory input need that they're seeking at that moment, if the visual stim is something else, it's just not going to work. So this can be a little bit more difficult to do, but it can be certainly worth trying. And the steps in assessing and replacing behavior is to start by using an assessment such as an FPA or a functional analysis to determine the function of the behavior. And then if you determine that it's a sensory function, you would determine what type. Is it sensory seeking or sensory avoiding? Then train that new skill. This is a part that I think people often skip. In any kind of functional communication or functional replacement training, very often we'll see, okay, it's an attention-seeking function, so he should just ask for attention. You need to train him how to ask for attention. And you need to do it in contrived situations over and over again and make the reinforcer much stronger for the replacement behavior. And then you maintain it by using that strategy and making sure that the reinforcer only happens when the person uses their new skill. Difficult to do, absolutely, with sensory behavior, because I can't prevent you from getting the feelings that you're getting from doing what you're doing. All I can do is try to give you a better, more acceptable way to get those feelings. So this is something certainly to try, but it can be challenging, and it's something that you might have to do a number of times. Try different types of responses, try different ways of training the alternative response to get to that point so that the person is able to replace their behavior. Finally, if the behavior is dangerous, self-injurious, or completely overly disruptive and it really needs to stop, you can use behavior reduction procedures. These are just some examples. DRO is something Bobby mentioned before. You get a reinforcer for periods of time of not doing the problem behavior. So if you want to, let's say, the sensory behavior we've determined is hand flapping, and that's something that you really enjoy doing, but we can't have you do it because you do it so much that you can't do anything else, then if you don't flap your hands for 5 minutes, I will withdraw and give you time to flap your hands. Or I'll deliver another, better yet, I would deliver another reinforcer so that you wouldn't, be practicing that problem behavior. But that might be the only reinforcer that's available. Another strategy is response interruption and redirection, and I'll just show you a visual here. It's a simple sequence of steps. The behavior occurs, the interventionist interrupts it, redirects it, and then returns to the original activity. So let's say somebody has verbal stims, they're scripting. As soon as the student starts to script, you interrupt them, you redirect to something else. So I would give them a different verbal thing to say. Say, I want a break, or say, let's play, and they are going to use those words, and then you're just going to go right back to the original activity. So we're in the middle of playing Candyland, there's 3 or 4 kids sitting around and we're playing Candyland, and my student with autism starts to flap. I might physically, gently stop, do this. It's a redirection, it's something different, you can't flap while you're doing this, and then we go right back to playing Candyland. And that's a strategy that's well researched for reducing this kind of behavior. The other visual there is the DRO just showing you that you would set the timer. If the behavior happens, you would stop the timer. You would restart the timer from the original interval, and when you get a full interval of no behavior targeted for reduction, you would deliver a reinforcer. And that's just the way that, that works. And just to go back for a moment, there are other strategies for reducing behavior, including response cost, which is where somebody loses something for engaging in the behavior. We have this all the time when we get a ticket, when we're speeding, or anything like that. A lot of the things, the reinforcers that control our behavior are based in losing something, and punishment techniques, which is really outside of the scope of this kind of a discussion. But when somebody's self-stimulatory or other sensory behavior is really dangerous to them or to somebody else, it might be necessary to use punishment strategies or response cost strategies to reduce the behavior, but only if absolutely necessary and under the right circumstances. So I just want to wrap up by saying that sensory differences can be managed. People with autism don't have to be uncomfortable all the time, and they don't have to be limited in their lives. We can help to reduce or change sensitivities. We can help them manage their own experiences in different ways and make the best of their differences. And I just want to share just a quick story. This is not somebody that I know personally. His name is Jonathan Bruno. I can say that he has autism. I can share that with you because this picture was taken from the Jumbotron in Times Square in New York. He was put up there as an athlete to be admired and recognized. He's a marathon runner. He's very challenged by his disability. He does not communicate. He's an adult male, and he can't say what he wants or needs, but he loves to run. And his parents, I was reading an article about him, and his parents describe he was a teenager before they found this outlet for him. And a coach said, you know, let me get him running. They're like, fine, go ahead, get him out of the house, do something with him. You know, he just wanted to sit around and watch TV and eat, which was not healthy and it wasn't productive. And he didn't love to run. But the coach exposed him. I don't think the coach was a behavior analyst. I think he just used practical common sense, exposed him, increased his time, and he's now a marathon runner. What's his time in the marathon?
The 3:30.
He's a fast guy. And his brothers, the only way that I know about him is that his brothers write about him. Like, he has a public Facebook page and that his brothers have created, and they describe him getting very tense and unhappy if he can't run. So I don't know. I don't know if it's a sensory experience for him, but apparently it feels good. It's good for him. He's doing something that's admirable, that, you know, has gotten him such positive attention and brought positive attention to what people with disabilities can do. And I think this is what we can strive for when we're helping people with their sensory differences. How can we make this something that works for you and that, you know, doesn't limit your life but expands it and helps? So now you can have lunch.